Hello, welcome to Diol Relation Tales. Please subscribe my channel. Dating someone from work is the worst mistake anyone can make, but what happens if you end up poking up with your boss? That's just what happened to me. My name is Harper. I am 30 years old and I am a graphic designer for a multinational company. To be honest, I love my job. But in the last month things started to get complicated. Our superiors had assigned us some goals that we had to achieve, and although I had previously achieved them with great ease, things were different when my goal was ridiculously high than that of my colleagues. That's why when Felix, my boss, asked me to work unpaid overtime to compensate for my lack of commitment, I didn't refuse. I knew it was natural for this to happen, but that didn't take away from the fact that it made me feel frustrated and a little humiliated. I had not lowered my performance, nor was I relaxing as many of my colleagues thought, but rather I was facing the challenge that for a person was almost impossible. However, I didn't complain or say anything. That company had been the only one that had hired me during my student days, so I couldn't just let them go. I had nothing to do but reluctantly accept what I had to do, or at least that's what I thought, until something made me change my mind. Harper, we must represent the company on a trip to the outskirts of the city, Felix said once I entered his office. I nodded, understanding that as always he wasn't asking me if I wanted to do it. On the contrary, I knew very well that this was an obligation for being part of the company, so I clenched my fists and gave the best of my smiles. Okay, I said, but first you must complete the goals and get your deliverables ready, he responded, smiling with his usual air of smugness. How will I do all that in 2 days? I asked before I could stop my tongue. It was physically difficult to do what he asked me with such short notice, so unless the other person hated me and wanted to make my life miserable, I didn't understand why the higher ups had suggested something like that. At that moment I felt my skin begin to itch. Realizing that I was uncomfortable, I didn't know how to respond to my boss's comment, especially considering that his arrogant face irritated me greatly. Of course, in my mind I did not hesitate to shout 1,001 words against her that would be considered inappropriate for a young lady. But on the outside my mouth seemed sealed. Do not speak. I just closed the door and spent the rest of the afternoon mortifying myself, thinking about what I should do to accomplish my task that day. When I got home I couldn't help but lie on my bed and cry. The situation was so unfair, so hopeless for me. Since I joined the company when I was just a college kid, I had done nothing but give my best. I was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. I brought food and coffee to superiors when they asked for it, and I went the extra mile, contributed in ideas so that things went as perfect as possible. But everything started to go wrong when Felix arrived. He came with his out-of-the-box ideas that made us work like crazy, and with his vision that everyone had to meet unattainable goals. He did not consider that any of these efforts deserve recognition. Quite the opposite for him. That was the rule that we all had to comply with, and we should not expect a gift for it. The worst part of all was that when he first came in I felt grateful. He had come to replace an old boss who no longer knew how to speak to the new generation, so he thought that a new younger director would bring good things to our company. Plus I couldn't lie about how handsome I'd always thought he was. Even when I had gotten a taste of his character, I couldn't help but notice how tall and handsome he was, with his tight-fitting suits that showed off an athletic, well-built physique, as well as an excellent taste in fashionable clothing. But 5 years had already passed since our first meeting. He's 40 and I'm 30, so I'm no longer the 20-some girl who fell in love with a handsome boss, one who had awakened a passion in me that no one could ever do. That was why, after thinking about it that night, I made the most important decision of my life I would resign after the trip so I could rebuild my life away from an environment that did not value me. No matter how much effort I made, who would have thought that just that decision would make things between my boss and me get hotter in many ways I didn't know. You could wear dresses, my boss murmured once I reached him. He was storing his suitcases in the van that the company had arranged for us. When he saw me walking towards his address, I didn't think it was inappropriate. Besides, it's cooler than wearing a suit, I replied. From the corner of my eye I could see how his face contorted, showing surprise. Of course she had to be, since sweet and understanding Harper never responded to anything. It was something that I didn't dare to do before, but I thought that if I was going to give up anyway, I wouldn't lose anything by freeing the thoughts from my mind by telling a few truths. The trip started quickly, and before I knew it we were on the road. During the ride, Felix didn't take his eyes off me, and I felt like a winner, even though sometimes I couldn't stop looking at him either. And of course he had a polo shirt tight around his torso that made him look more muscular than usual. I wanted to mentally scold myself, since there was no point in admiring a man who at that moment had made me spend the last 48 hours sitting in front of a computer while my hand ached from all the designs I had to deliver. But there was no point. I was just a woman, and my boss was an overly attractive man, but that wouldn't be the only thing he would do that day. In fact, you'd have the perfect opportunity to take a closer look, and that's all. Thanks to a flat tire, the news that it would take longer to arrive turned into several apologetic calls from the transport company, which offered to give us accommodation in a partner hotel that was close to we were. If you see, well, I had gotten a moment of rest since that forced us to stop the trip to wait for a new van the next day. I could take the rest of the day as compensation for the extra work I had to do the previous days. Furthermore, I would have the hotel facilities to enjoy what I had done myself for years by continuing to work mop. Everything would have been wonderful if it weren't for the fact that my boss was a workaholic who made us meet in a room to finalize details that we had already discussed before. These are the reports that you must correct, he told me, pointing to the large pile of sheets that could be seen on the table. And when we arrived, I want you to make a record of all the objects you see, one by one, so it'll take forever, I thought automatically as I watched him ramble on about what I should do. But at that point I realized that I was going back to doing what I had promised so much to eradicate in my life. I didn't want to continue putting up with so many bad times in a place where my own boss didn't value me, so I decided that the unfortunate situation become my way of quitting. No, I said firmly. No, he asked, raising an eyebrow as if he were preparing to be challenged. And why? His posture seemed calm, but at the same time tense, as if his face wanted to soften the situation, while his body was ready to put up a fight if necessary. I'm not willing to continue putting up with abuses, I told him, feeling how he freed me instantly. I have had a very bad time in recent months, and I feel that no one values my efforts, so here I come. I quit, knowing that my speech was worse than any I had imagined at the time, but that it had been the most sincere of all. I decided it was time to leave the place and allow myself to be free, even though I didn't know how I would get back the next day. But then happened. Felix's hand flew to my arm, stopping my escape. His touch was firm, strong, but at the same time careful, as if my skin was burning him. There was that feeling again, that tingly ing that ran through me, that seemed to spark sparks between us. At that moment I realized that several years could pass, and I would hate him with all my bones, but he would still have that effect on me. However, when I was ready to complain and refute any comment on his part, he stared at me. You can't give up. No, he insisted again, you can't leave without me doing this first, and taking my face firmly, he made our Mouths join in a passionate kiss that consumed us like fire. I remained static for a moment until I realized what was happening. I was kissing my boss in a co-working room where most of the people were dedicated to closing contracts, finishing pending tasks, or simply having to chat with colleagues. But Felix's lips were warm and seductive enough that, after a few seconds, I completely forgot about it. The only thing I could think about was our mouths joined together as we seemed to have a battle over who dominated who inside them. We didn't have to go anywhere else to do what we wanted so much. In that same room we released the tension that we had not resolved during the long years we had been working, praying to everything divine that no one would break in because we had not placed any security. Luckily nothing happened other than feeling my body vibrating because of what Felix, my boss, provoked in me. No man in my life resembled what he had given me in that room, so I didn't have to think twice when he asked me to repeat the same thing in the room he had been assigned. From that trip our relationship was transformed. It was no longer just a boss and an employee, but two people who couldn't keep their hands to themselves. It was crazy to be both in the same office because we couldn't stop observing each other and dropping the occasional accidental touch. We didn't formally date because soon Felix found a partner and I didn't think it was a good idea to have a relationship at work either. However, when night fell while we were working overtime, we both took care not to let the R feel stressed by all the pending tasks. Making out with the boss may seem crazy, but for me it was the best experience of my life, and I wouldn't change what I experienced in that workroom for anything or anyone. Have you ever had an experience like this with your boss? I would like you to tell me in the comments. See you in the next story.